She was on her knees in the dirt when he said it, both hands buried in the warm side of a calf that wouldn't stand her braids soaked through her father 3 months dead and the whole town watching her fail. And Ethan Callaway, tall in his saddle, looked down at her and laughed. "At this rate, miss, you'll never get married." Clara Whitmore didn't cry. She rose, wiped her hands, looked him dead in the eye and whispered, "Only if you ask me." Then she turned and walked away. He had no idea she'd just saved his life. If a woman who refused to break has ever meant something to you, take 1 second to subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story has traveled all the way out to where you're sitting right now. The calf had been down near the dry creek bed since first light, and Clara Whitmore had been beside it for 3 hours before anyone bothered to come look. She knew the animal was dying. She'd known it the moment she'd seen the white foam dried at the corners of its mouth, the way its flank heaved too fast and too shallow, the way its eyes had gone soft and far away. But knowing a thing and accepting it were 2 different roads, and Clara had never been the sort to walk the easy one. "Come on now," she said low, the way her father used to talk to spooked horses. "Come on, you ain't done yet. You hear me? You ain't done." The calf didn't answer. Calves never did. But she pressed both palms flat against its ribs and felt the shudder run through it, and she kept talking anyway, because the talking was for her as much as for the animal. She'd lost 4 head already that summer. 4 out of 19. Each one had been a coin pulled out of a purse that was already near empty, and Clara had buried each one the same way alone with a shovel that had been her father's in ground so hard the summer had baked it like brick. This calf made 5. And 5 was the number that broke her, though she would not have admitted it to a living soul. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw the man. Heavy, unhurried, a big horse ridden by a man in no particular rush, and she knew without looking who it would be. There was only one ranch that bordered hers on the creekside, and only one man who rode like he already owned every blade of grass his shadow touched. Ethan Callaway reined up at the fence line and sat there a moment looking down at her. He didn't get off his horse. That told her everything she needed to know about how this was going to go. "Your animal's in my field again," he said. Clara didn't lift her head. "She ain't in your field. She's in the creek bed. The creek bed ain't yours." "The creek bed's the line. Everybody knows the creek bed's the line." "Then I reckon everybody's wrong." She still didn't look at him. "Same as everybody's been wrong about a lot of things." She heard the saddle creak as he shifted his weight. "Miss Whitmore, that's the 3rd time this month one of your strays has come through my fence. I've got 200 head of cattle that don't need to be mingling with whatever sickness yours are carrying." "She ain't sick." Now Clara looked up and her eyes were hot. "She's poisoned." The word landed wrong in the dry air, and for a moment Ethan Callaway didn't seem to understand it. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a short dark beard, and the kind of weathered face that had spent more years squinting at the sun than smiling at anyone. He had a reputation in Ridge Creek for being fair and being hard, and most folks couldn't tell you which one came first. "Poisoned," he repeated. "You heard me. Animals don't get poisoned, miss. They get sick. They eat the wrong weed, they drink stagnant water, they foam at the mouth like this." Clara peeled back the calf's lip with 2 fingers, and the dried froth showed white against the pink. "They go blind and stagger like a drunk man and drop where they stand. You ever seen a weed do that, Mr. Callaway, because I've been ranching this dirt my whole life and I never have." That stopped him. She watched it stop him. Something flickered behind those serious eyes, and she could almost see the man doing arithmetic he didn't want to do. "Where'd she drink?" he said. It wasn't a question anymore. Clara nodded toward the creek bed. There was a low spot in it where the spring runoff still pooled even in the dry months, a shallow brown puddle ringed with cracked mud. "There. Same place they all been drinking. Same place yours drink, I'd wager. The creek runs down off your high pasture before it ever gets to mine." For the first time, Ethan Callaway got off his horse. He came through the fence, through the gap her calf had made, which Clara noted and did not mention, and he crouched down by the puddle and looked at it for a long moment. Then he dipped 2 fingers in and brought them to his nose, and his whole body went still. "That ain't right," he said quietly. "No," said Clara. "It ain't. Smells like—" He stopped, wiped his hand hard against his trousers like the smell might cling. "Smells sweet. Water shouldn't smell sweet. It's lead, or arsenic. My father kept a book on it, the cattle diseases and the poisons both. Sweet smell foaming the blindness. Somebody put something in this water, Mr. Callaway, and it ran downhill from your land to mine." The big man stood up slowly, and Clara could see the exact moment the fear arrived in him, because it arrived the same way it had arrived in her that morning, not all at once, but in stages like water finding the cracks. "My cattle drink off this creek," he said. "I know. 200 head. They've been drinking off this creek for—" His jaw worked. "How long does it take? The poison? How long before they show?" "Depends how much they took. Depends what it is." Clara rose to her feet, brushing the dust from her apron with the backs of her hands because her palms were filthy. "Days maybe. Maybe sooner. If your high pastures where it got and your cattle been drinking it longer and stronger than mine ever did." And there it was. She watched the fear settle into the man's bones and take up residence, and some small, mean part of her, a part she wasn't proud of, felt a flash of grim satisfaction. Because not 10 minutes ago, before he'd understood, this man had sat up on his fine horse and looked down at her in the dirt and said the cruelest thing anyone had said to her since her father died. She hadn't forgotten it. She wasn't going to forget it. "You laughed at me," Clara said. Ethan Callaway blinked. "What?" "When you rode up, you looked at me down here in the dirt with this dying animal, and you said—" She made her voice flat and false, an imitation of his. "At this rate, miss, you'll never get married." She let the words hang. "You remember saying that?" The man had the grace at least to look like he'd been struck. "Miss Whitmore, I didn't." "You did." Her voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was worse. "You sat up there, and you laughed at a woman trying to save the only thing she's got left in this world, and you made a little joke about how no man would ever want her. Like the worst thing that could happen to me is staying unmarried. Like I've been down here in the dirt all morning praying for a husband to come save me. That ain't what I— Only if you ask me." The words came out so soft, he had to lean in to catch them. And then they registered, and his face did something complicated, and Clara almost laughed herself. "What did you say?" he asked. "You said no man'd be fool enough to marry me." Clara picked up her father's shovel from where it leaned against the fence post. "And I said only if you ask me, Mr. Callaway. Only the one brave enough to ask. The rest of you can keep laughing from up on your horses where it's safe." And then she did the thing she'd been wanting to do since the moment he rode up. She turned her back on him and walked away. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. She walked across that cracked summer ground with the shovel over her shoulder and her chin level and her braids swinging against her back, and she did not look behind her even once, even though every nerve in her body was screaming to know what his face was doing. "Miss Whitmore!" he called after her. She kept walking. "Miss Whitmore, your calf." "My calf is dying," she called back without turning. "And there ain't a thing on God's earth you can do about that now. So you go on and worry about your own 200 head, Mr. Callaway. You go on and worry about your own." She made it all the way to her own barn before her legs started shaking. Her father had been dead 3 months, and Clara still set 2 cups out for coffee every morning before she remembered. She did it that evening too, out of habit, 2 tin cups on the rough plank table, and then she stood there looking at the second one and felt the grief come up her throat like it always did, sudden and total, a wave that had nothing to do with how much time had passed. She poured the second cup back into the pot. She'd learned not to fight it. You couldn't fight grief any more than you could fight weather. You just stood in it and waited for it to pass through. Thomas Whitmore had been a careful man. A bookish man, strange as that sounded for a rancher out in the Montana grass. He'd taught Clara her letters and her numbers before she could properly ride, and he'd kept books on everything: the cattle, the weather, the money, the land. especially the land. There was a whole shelf of his ledgers in the corner, leather-bound and water-stained, and Clara had read every one of them more times than she could count. A man who keeps his figures honest. Her father used to say, can't be cheated by a man who doesn't. You remember that, Clara girl. The figures don't lie. People lie. Figures don't. She thought about that now, sitting alone at the table with one cup of coffee going cold. Because somebody had poisoned that creek, and poison cost money. And a man didn't spend money poisoning a creek that ran through two struggling ranches unless he had a reason. Unless those two ranches were worth more to him dead than alive. Clara knew who wanted her land. Everybody in Ridge Creek knew who wanted everybody's land. His name was Silas Mercer, and he'd come to the valley 2 years back, wearing a good coat and a calm voice, and he'd been buying up the small ranches one by one ever since. He paid in cash. He was always polite. And every family that sold to him left town within the month, and nobody ever heard from them again, and nobody ever asked too many questions about why. Mercer had come to see Clara's father about the Whitmore place 8 months before Thomas died. Clara remembered the visit. She remembered her father going quiet at the supper table afterward, and she remembered him taking down one of his ledgers that night, and sitting up by the lamp long past, when he usually went to bed, running his finger down columns of figures she couldn't see from across the room. "What did Mr. Mercer want, Pa?" she'd asked. "He wants to buy us out." "Are we going to sell?" Her father had looked up at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not fear exactly. Something colder than fear. Something like a man who'd just realized the ground he was standing on wasn't ground at all. "No," Thomas Whitmore had said. "We're not going to sell. And Clara, if anything ever happens to me, you don't sell either, no matter what they tell you, no matter what paper they put in front of you. You read it 3 times, and then you read it a 4th, and you don't sign a thing till you understand every word. You hear me? Pa, you're scaring me." "Good," he'd said. "Stay a little scared. Scared people read the fine print." 4 months later, he was dead thrown from a horse, they said found at the bottom of a ravine, with his neck broken, and Clara had never once believed it was an accident, though she'd never had a thing to prove it wasn't. Now there was poison in the creek. She got up from the table and crossed to her father's shelf and took down the ledger he'd been reading that last winter, the one bound in cracked brown leather. And she lit the second lamp even though lamp oil cost money, and she sat down to read until she understood. She read until the sky outside went from black to gray, and somewhere around the time the roosters started, Clara Whitmore found the thing her father had found. The thing that had taken the color out of his face at the supper table. The thing she was now nearly certain that had gotten him killed. It was a map, folded small and tucked between 2 pages drawn in her father's careful hand, copied off something she didn't know what, and it showed the whole Ridge Creek Valley with a line running through it. A straight line drawn with a rule that ran right down the length of the creek and out the far end of the valley toward the Bozeman Road. And along that line in her father's small, tight letters, 2 words. Rail Survey. Clara sat back. She didn't understand all of it. Not yet. But she understood enough to feel her heart start hammering because a rail line meant the railroad. And the railroad meant money, the likes of which a Montana rancher couldn't even properly imagine. And any ranch that sat on the path of that line would be worth 100 times what it was worth as grass and cattle. Silas Mercer wasn't buying ranches. He was buying a railroad's worth of land. One poor family at a time for the price of grass, before any of them ever found out what it was truly worth. And the 2 ranches that sat square in the middle of his line, the 2 he hadn't been able to buy, the 2 whose owners had looked at his calm face and his good coat, and said no, were hers, and Ethan Callaway's. He came back at dawn. Clara heard the horse, and this time she was ready for it standing in her own doorway with her father's ledger held against her chest and her face washed and her hair rebraided, and when Ethan Callaway rode up to her gate, she didn't wait for him to speak first. "You lose any?" she asked. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept either. "6, he said. 6 head down by midnight. I've been up all night dragging cattle off the high creek and trying to find clean water to put in front of them." He swung down off the horse heavy like his bones hurt. "I lost 6 head of cattle, Miss Whitmore, and I've been standing in my own pasture half the night thinking about what you said to me yesterday." "Which part?" "All of it." He came to the gate, but he didn't open it. He stood on the far side of it, with his hat in his hands, and Clara had never once in 2 years seen Ethan Callaway hold his hat in his hands for anybody. "I owe you an apology." "You owe me a lot of things." "I reckon I do." His jaw tightened. "But I'm starting with the apology because it's the one I can pay this morning. What I said to you yesterday about no man marrying you, that was a cruel, low thing to say to a woman who was on her knees trying to save a dying animal. My mother, God rest her, would have taken a switch to me for it. I'm ashamed of it, and I'm sorry." Clara studied him for a long moment. She'd had a whole speech ready. She'd practiced it half the night while she read by lamplight all the things she was going to say to Ethan Callaway the next time he had the nerve to show his face at her gate. About pride. About men who laughed from horseback. About how she'd buried her father alone and dug 5 graves for her animals alone, and that she didn't need any man's pity and didn't want it. But the man at her gate had his hat in his hands and 6 dead cattle behind him, and grief sitting in his eyes that matched her own, and somehow the speech didn't seem worth giving anymore. "All right," she said. He blinked. "All right. All right, I accept your apology. Don't make me say it twice, I'm tired." She came down off her step and crossed the yard to the gate. "Now you listen to me, Mr. Callaway, because I've been up all night same as you, only I wasn't dragging cattle. I was reading. And I found out who poisoned that creek, and I found out why, and I found out it's a sight worse than you or me losing a few head of stock." "You know who did it." "I know who, and I can prove some of it and not all of it, and the part I can't prove yet is the part that's going to take some doing." She held up the ledger. "You know how to read figures, Mr. Callaway." He looked taken aback. "I can cipher well enough to run a ranch." "That ain't what I asked. I asked if you can read figures. Because I can. My father taught me. I can take a stack of land deeds and tax records and survey papers and tell you which ones are honest and which ones are lies. And right now, there's a man in this valley sitting on a whole stack of lies, and I aim to read every last one of them out loud in front of the whole town before I'm through." Ethan Callaway looked at the small, dusty woman on the other side of the gate, holding her dead father's ledger against her chest, like a breastplate, and something shifted in his face. The condescension she'd seen yesterday was gone. In its place was something she hadn't expected at all. It was respect. "Silas Mercer," he said slowly. "Silas Mercer. He came to me too, last spring, offered me a fair price for the ranch, said he was putting together a cattle outfit." Ethan's mouth twisted. "I told him I'd sell my ranch the day they buried me in it." "Well?" Clara opened the gate. "It appears Mr. Mercer took you at your word. He just figured he'd handle the burying part himself and start with the water." The big man went very still. "My father said the same thing." Clara went on, and now her voice did waver just slightly, just at the edges. "Said he'd never sell. Said it right to Mercer's face. And 4 months later, they found him at the bottom of Cutter's Ravine with a broke neck and a horse that came home without a scratch on it. And everybody in this town shook their heads and said, what a shame. What a terrible accident, poor motherless Clara, however will she manage?" Her eyes were burning now, but she would not let them spill. "Nobody asked how a man who'd ridden that ravine trail 1,000 times just up and fell off it one quiet afternoon. Nobody but me." Ethan Callaway took his hat off again, held it against his chest this time. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I am sorry about your father. I should have said it months ago. The whole town should have." The whole town was scared. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, quick and angry. "Same as they're scared now. Mercer's got half of Ridge Creek owing him money, and the other half wanting to. You start a fight with a man like that, you find out real fast how alone you are." She looked up at him. "I've been alone a long while, Mr. Callaway. I'm used to it. But you got 200 head of cattle drinking poisoned water, and a man who wants you dead, and I got a stack of my father's books that might be the only thing in this valley that can hang Silas Mercer. So the question ain't whether you're sorry. The question is whether you're brave." The morning was quiet around them. Somewhere out in the pasture, a cow lowed low and mournful. The man at the gate looked at the woman for a long, long moment. "You asked me yesterday," he said finally, "whether any man be brave enough." "I recall. Reckon I'd like the chance to answer it." Ethan Callaway settled his hat back on his head and looked down at her with those serious eyes, and for the first time there was no horse between them, and no fence, and no laughing. "Show me the books, Miss Whitmore. Show me everything. And then you tell me where Silas Mercer is, and we'll find out together just how brave I am." Clara Whitmore looked at him, and then for the first time in 3 months, the first time since they'd carried her father down off that ravine, Clara Whitmore did something that surprised even her. She smiled. "Come on in then," she said, and held the gate. "Coffee's already made. And Mr. Callaway, bring your figures with you. Because before this is done, we're going to need every honest number we can find." He stepped through the gate, and behind them, out across the dry summer grass, the creek kept running its slow, poisoned course down from the high pasture, sweet and clear and deadly, carrying its secret all the way to the bottom of the valley, where a man in a good coat sat on a porch. He intended to own, drinking clean water from his own private well. Entirely certain that 2 stubborn ranchers and 1 dead bookkeeper's daughter would never ever figure out what he'd done. He was wrong about that. He was about to find out just how wrong.
Mình dừng part 1 ở đây đúng yêu cầu không giới thiệu phần sau. Khi nào anh cần mình viết tiếp part 2?
Rising action liền mạch tứ cảnh hai người ngồi đọc xô sách đầy nhịp mini climax, và để Clara dùng kỹ năng đọc giấy tờ đặt dẫn dắt điều tra. "Anh muốn mình viết tiếp part 2 luôn không?" He sat down at her father's table like a man who wasn't sure the chair would hold him, and Clara poured the coffee and set the cracked brown ledger between them, and for a moment neither of them said a word. "Well," Ethan said finally. "Show me." She opened the book to the page she'd marked with a strip of rawhide and turned it to face him, and she watched his eyes move down the columns and then stop the way her own had stopped the night before, on the small folded map tucked into the binding. "What is it?" he said. "Open it." He did careful, like the paper might come apart in his hands, and she saw him read the 2 words her father had written along that straight ruled line. She saw his lips move around them. "Rail survey." "That ain't possible," he said. "Why ain't it?" "Because there's no railroad coming through Ridge Creek. There's been talk of it for years. Talk of a spur off the main line to bring cattle to the Bozeman yards. But it's just talk. It's always just talk." "It was just talk," Clara said, "right up until somebody with money figured out where the line was going to run and started quietly buying every acre it'd cross, for grass prices, from folks too poor and too scared to know what they were sitting on." Ethan looked up from the map slow. "Mercer." "Mercer." He set the paper down on the table and pressed it flat with one big hand, and Clara could see him doing the arithmetic her father had done at this same table 8 months before, the same arithmetic that had taken the color out of Thomas Whitmore's face and put a cold thing in his eyes. "My ranch sits on this line," Ethan said, "right in the middle of it. And yours, right next to mine." Clara tapped the map. 2 ranches, Mr. Callaway. 2 ranches square in the path, and 2 owners who told Silas Mercer to go to the devil. My father and you. That's all that's standing between that man and more money than either of us could count in 10 lifetimes. "And your father's dead." The words sat there in the kitchen between them, heavy and plain, and Clara made herself say it. "My father's dead, and now there's poison in the creek that runs through both our places. You're a smart man. You finished the line of figures." Ethan Callaway didn't finish it out loud. He didn't have to. She watched his hand close slowly into a fist on the tabletop, watched the knuckles go white, and she understood that whatever else this man was proud, hard, slow to apologize, he wasn't a fool, and he wasn't a coward either. And the thing that had just arrived behind his eyes was not fear anymore. It was fury. "He killed your father," Ethan said. "I can't prove it." "But you believe it." "I have believed it every single day since they carried him home," Clara said, and her voice was steady, but her hands were not, and she put them in her lap so he wouldn't see. And nobody in this whole valley would stand with me when I said it. They patted my hand and told me grief makes folks imagine things. So I stopped saying it. I just started reading. Ethan stood up so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. Then we go to the sheriff, he said. Today, right now, we take this map and this book and we lay it in front of Sheriff Doyle and we what? Clara didn't move. We show him a map my dead father drew off a survey we can't produce. We tell him a rich man poisoned a creek with no witness and no proof, but a dead calf and your 6 head of cattle, which everybody in town will say died of bad water. That's been bad all summer. We accuse Silas Mercer of murder when the doctor signed the paper that says my father fell off a horse. She shook her head slowly. Sit down, Mr. Callaway. You been awake all night same as me. You ain't thinking straight. You go to Doyle today with what we got, and you know what happens. Mercer hears about it by supper, and then he knows we know. And then it ain't just my father in that ravine. The big man stood there, breathing hard for a moment. Then he sat back down. All right, he said. All right, you're right. I hate that you're right, but you're right. He dragged a hand down his face. So what do? We get proof he can't twist. Clara pulled the ledger back toward herself. My father always said the figures don't lie. People lie. Figures don't. Somewhere there's paper with Mercer's lies written on it, deeds, records, survey papers, something, and paper can be read by anybody who knows how to read it. I aim to find that paper. And you're going to help me because you can go places and talk to people a woman alone can't. Such as the creek. First, today. She stood. Before we go chasing paper across the county, I want to see with my own eyes where that poison went in. Because if somebody put it in deliberate, and they did, then they left a mark on the ground doing it. And I want to find that mark before the next rain washes it clean. Ethan looked at her for a long beat. Then slowly a corner of his mouth turned up, not a smile exactly, but the cousin of one. You'd have made a fine lawman, Miss Whitmore. I'd have made a fine lot of things, Clara said, reaching for her hat, if anybody'd ever once asked me what I wanted to be. They rode up the creek together that morning, her on her old gray mare and him on his big bay, and for the first hour they hardly spoke at all, just followed the water up out of her low pasture and across the broken line of his fence and up toward the high ground where the creek came down off the ridge. And the higher they went, the worse the water got. Clara could smell it now, that wrong sweetness growing stronger the closer they came to the top. Here, she said suddenly and reined up. Look, the cattle quit drinking here. Ethan looked. She was right. There was a churned, muddy patch where his herd had come down to water hoof prints all over, and then above it, nothing. No prints. Clean ground. They smelled it, Clara said. Animals are smarter than people about water. They drank below this point and got sick. Above it is where it went in. Ethan was already swinging down off his horse. Come on. They walked the bank above the churned crossing, leading their horses, both of them with their eyes on the ground, and it was Clara who found a place where the bank had been disturbed, where someone had stood, where the grass was crushed flat in a wide patch, and the mud held the round flat impressions of something heavy set down and lifted again. Barrels, she said. He brought it in barrels. Set them down right here. She crouched and pressed her fingers into one of the round marks. 2 of them, maybe 3. Stood right here and tipped them into the water and let it run downhill to do the rest. Ethan crouched beside her. Wagon couldn't get up here. Too steep, too rocky. He'd have had to pack the barrels in on horses. Or mules. Clara pointed. Look at the prints. Those ain't shod like riding horses. Those are pack animals, walking slow, carrying weight. And they came... She stood and turned, following the tracks back with her eyes. They came from the north. From over the ridge, not from the road, from Mercer's side of the valley. She turned to look at him and found Ethan Callaway already looking at her, and there was something in his face she didn't have a name for. What? She said. Nothing. He stood up. Just most folks would have walked right past all this and seen mud. You walk past it and see a man's whole crime laid out like a story. That's because most folks ain't been reading their dead father's books by lamplight for 3 months, looking for the thing that got him killed. Clara turned away so he wouldn't see what his words had done to her face. It ain't a gift, Mr. Callaway. It's just grief that learned to count. They followed the pack animal tracks north over the ridge until the trail gave out on hard rock, and they were sitting their horses at the top of the ridge, looking down the far slope, when Ethan said quiet, "That's the Henderson place down there." Clara followed his gaze. A small ranch sat in the fold of the next valley, a poor and patched-together place with a man out front mending a fence that didn't look worth the mending. "Abel Henderson," she said. "He owes Mercer money. Everybody knows it." "He owes Mercer his whole place is what he owes him." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Mortgaged it to him last winter when his wife took sick. Folks said Mercer was being Christian about it. Folks said a lot of things about Mercer that turned out to be wrong." He gathered his reins. "Those mule tracks came from over this way, Miss Whitmore. And Abel Henderson keeps mules." Clara's heart picked up. "You think Henderson poisoned the creek?" "I think Abel Henderson is a weak, scared man who owes a powerful one more than he can ever pay." Ethan started his horse down the slope. "And I think weak, scared men do terrible things when somebody's got a rope around their neck. Come on. But let me do the talking. Abel's known me 20 years. He'll spook if a stranger starts asking." Abel Henderson saw them coming and stood up from his fence work slow, and Clara watched the man's face do something frightened and false all at once. "Ethan," Henderson called out too friendly. "What brings you all the way over the ridge? And Miss Whitmore, ain't it Tom's girl?" "That's right," Clara said. "Awful sorry about your daddy. Awful sorry. He was a fine man." Henderson wiped his hands on his trousers. They were shaking just a little, and Clara saw it. "What can I do for you folks?" Ethan didn't get off his horse. He just sat there a moment looking down at Abel Henderson and let the silence stretch out long and uncomfortable. "Abel," he said finally. "Somebody poisoned the creek. The one that runs down through my place and Miss Whitmore's. I lost 6 head of cattle. She lost 5. Whoever did it packed the poison in on mules and brought it over the ridge from this side of the valley." A pause. "And you're about the only man on this side of the valley keeps mules." The color went right out of Abel Henderson's face. "Now, Ethan," he said. "Now, Ethan, you don't think I don't know what you'd do, Abel. I used to know. Don't reckon I do anymore." Ethan leaned forward over his saddle horn. "Here's what I know. I know your mules walked up that ridge sometime in the last few days carrying something heavy because their tracks are still up there for any man to read. And I know there's poison in 2 creeks now and dead cattle on 2 ranches. And I know that's the kind of thing that gets a man hanged, Abel. Not the man who paid for it, the man who carried it." A long, terrible pause. "The man whose mules left tracks." Abel Henderson made a sound that wasn't quite a word. And then, to Clara's astonishment, the man's legs seemed to go out from under him, and he sat down hard on the bottom rail of his own broken fence and put his face in his hands. "He's going to take everything," Henderson whispered. "Lord help me, he's going to take everything I got." "Mercer," Ethan said. "He came to me 3 nights ago." Henderson didn't look up. His voice came out muffled and broken through his hands. "Said I was 4 months behind. Said he could call the whole note any day he pleased and put me and Martha out on the road with nothing. Martha's still poorly, Ethan. She can't take the road. She can't take it." He raised his face, and it was wet. "He said all I had to do was take the mules and the barrels up the ridge one night and not ask what was in them. Said if I did that, he'd forgive me 2 months of the note. And if I didn't—" His voice cracked clean in half. "If I didn't, he said Martha'd be sleeping in a ditch by Sunday." Clara felt her stomach turn over. Beside her, Ethan had gone very still. "What was in the barrels, Abel?" he said quietly. "I don't know. I swear before God I don't know. I didn't open them. I didn't want to know." Henderson wiped his face with a shaking hand. "But it smelled sweet. Sweet and wrong. And I packed it up that ridge, and I tipped it in the water where he told me to, and I have not slept a wink since, Ethan, not one wink, because I knew there was cattle drinking off that water. There's worse than cattle drinking off it, Clara said. Her voice came out harder than she meant it to. There's children, Mr. Henderson. There's the Pruitt children downstream of my place. They water their stock and wash their clothes and let their babies wade in that creek all summer long. Abel Henderson looked at her with horror dawning slow across his ruined face. I didn't, he started. You didn't think? No. Scared men don't. Clara made herself breathe. But you can think now. You can make it right now. You're going to tell us everything. Every word Mercer said. Every time he came. And you're going to be willing to say it again to a judge when the time comes. He'll kill me, Henderson whispered. He killed Tom Whitmore. Everybody knows he killed Tom Whitmore, even if nobody'll say it. He'll kill me too. The kitchen of Clara's mind went very quiet and then very loud. Say that again, she said. Henderson froze like a man who just realized the word he'd let out couldn't be called back. Say it again, Mr. Henderson. Clara had gone white now, too. You said everybody knows. Knows what? What do you know about my father? Abel Henderson looked from Clara to Ethan and backtrapped, and for a long moment, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then the words came out of him in a rush, like water through a broke dam. There was a man, he said. Worked for Mercer. Big fella came up from Cheyenne, name of Roy Patch. He drank some down at the saloon the week after your daddy died. Drank too much and got to talking the way men do. Henderson swallowed. Said a cinch don't cut itself. Said your daddy's horse came home without a scratch because there weren't nothing wrong with the horse. Said the only thing wrong was a saddle cinch that had been cut 3/4 through with a knife so it'd hold fine on level ground and let go the second a man took it down a steep grade. He looked up miserable. And then Roy Patch laughed Miss Whitmore. He laughed and he said, old fool should have sold when he had the chance. The world tilted under Clara Whitmore. She had believed it. She had believed it for 3 months alone with no one to believe it alongside her. But believing a thing in the dark of your own heart and hearing it said out loud in the daylight by a living man were two different things entirely. And the second one nearly took her off her horse. A cinch don't cut itself. Where is he? She heard herself say. This Roy Patch, where is he now? Gone, said Henderson. Mercer sent him off somewhere right after he ran his mouth. Nobody's seen him since spring. Henderson's face crumpled. I'm sorry, Miss Whitmore. I'm sorry about your daddy, and I'm sorry about your cattle, and I'm sorry I ever let that man put a rope around my neck. But I got a sick wife and a mortgage I can't pay, and that's the truth of why I did it, and I don't expect God or you to forgive me for it. Clara couldn't speak. She felt Ethan's eyes on her, felt the careful way he was watching her, ready to catch her if she fell, and she would not fall. She would not in front of Abel Henderson, not in front of anyone. It was Ethan who spoke. Abel, he said, you're going to do exactly what Miss Whitmore said. You're going to keep your mouth shut and your head down, and you're going to act like nothing's changed, so Mercer don't get spooked. And when the day comes, and it's coming, you're going to stand up in front of the law and tell every word of this. You do that, and I give you my word as your neighbor of 20 years, you and Martha will not lose this place. Not the house, not the land, not one fence post. You hear me? Henderson stared at him. Mercer holds the note, Ethan. There ain't a thing. There is if the note's part of a crooked scheme, and it is. Ethan's voice was iron. You let us worry about the note. You just be ready to tell the truth when we ask you to. Can you do that? Abel Henderson looked at the two of them for a long moment, and then slowly the man nodded. They rode back over the ridge in silence, and they were halfway down the other side before Ethan finally said gently, You want to stop a minute, Miss Whitmore? No. It'd be all right if you... I said no. Her voice came out raw. If I stop Mr. Callaway, I don't know that I'll be able to start again, and I've got too much to do to fall apart now. So I am not going to stop. I am going to ride home, and I am going to make supper, and tomorrow I am going to ride to the county seat at Bozeman, and I am going to read every deed and every land record in that courthouse until I find the paper that hangs Silas Mercer. She stared straight ahead. He cut my father's cinch. He let an old man ride to his death over money. And then he poisoned the water and let it run downhill onto my land and called it bad luck. I am going to find the paper, Mr. Callaway, and I am going to read it out loud in front of the whole town, and then I am going to watch them put a rope around his neck. That's what I'm going to do, so no, I don't want to stop." Ethan Callaway said nothing for a long while. They came down off the ridge and onto the flat, and her own farm came into view in the distance, small and poor and stubborn against the brown grass. "My wife died," he said suddenly. Clara turned to look at him. She hadn't known. The whole valley had 100 stories about Ethan Callaway, but never that one. 5 years back, he went on, eyes forward. "Fever. Took her in 9 days. We'd been married a year." His jaw worked. "And after I decided I was done. Done with all of it, with needing anybody, with letting anybody in, with the whole foolish business of caring for a thing that could be took from you. I built fences. I bought cattle. I told myself I was independent, strong, a man who didn't need a single soul." He glanced at her. "And then yesterday I rode up on a woman in the dirt fighting for a dying animal. And I was so busy being strong and independent and proud that I laughed at her. Like a damned fool. Like the worst kind of coward there is, the kind that mistakes a hard heart for a brave one." Clara didn't say anything. She didn't trust her voice. "I'm telling you this," Ethan said, "because you just told me you don't want to stop, and I understand it. Lord, do I understand it. You stop, you feel it, so you keep moving so you don't have to feel it." He pulled up his horse and she pulled up beside him, and he looked at her straight. "But you ain't alone in this anymore, Miss Whitmore. Whatever else happens. You've been carrying this by yourself for 3 months, and you carried it strong, and now you don't have to carry it alone. That's all I wanted to say." And Clara Whitmore, who had not cried at her father's grave, who had not cried digging 5 holes for 5 poisoned animals, who had not cried when Abel Henderson said the words, "A cinch don't cut itself." Clara Whitmore sat on her old gray mare in the middle of the brown grass and felt the tears come finally, hot and silent, running down her dusty face. She didn't sob, she didn't shake, she just let them fall. And Ethan Callaway didn't say a word about it, didn't reach for her, didn't tell her to hush. He just sat his horse beside her and waited, hat in his hand, the way a man waits out a hard rain until she was done. "All right," she said at last, wiping her face. "All right. Bozeman, tomorrow. First light." "First light," he agreed. What neither of them knew riding home through the long gold afternoon was that they were already too late to keep their search a secret, because Abel Henderson, weak and scared and full of guilt, had done one last weak and scared thing that very afternoon. He had ridden into Ridge Creek to drown his shame in a bottle, and there, 3 drinks deep with his guilt sitting on him like a stone. He had let something slip to the wrong man, a thin, watchful fellow at the end of the bar who said little and listened to everything and rode for Silas Mercer. Ethan Callaway and the Whitmore girl Henderson had muttered into his glass. They figured it out. Lord forgive me, they figured the whole thing out, and now they're going to make it right. By the time the sun went down, that thin, watchful man was sitting in Silas Mercer's parlor. And Silas Mercer, calm as ever, had listened to every word, and then folded his hands and smiled the small, cold smile that nobody in Ridge Creek ever got to see, and said only this, "Then we'll have to be quicker than they are." The next morning Clara was up before the roosters, and Ethan met her at her gate with 2 fresh horses and a packed saddlebag, and they rode the long road to Bozeman together as the sun came up. They hardly spoke. They didn't need to. Something had settled between them on the ridge the day before, some quiet understanding that didn't require words, and Clara found to her own surprise that she liked riding beside him. That the silence with him in it was a better silence than the silence of her empty kitchen. The county courthouse at Bozeman was a square stone building full of dust and old men, and the clerk who minded the land records was a sour fellow named Pettigrew, who plainly did not care for a woman asking to see official papers. "These records are for parties with legal interest, miss," he sniffed. "I am a party with legal interest," Clara said pleasantly. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I own the Whitmore Ranch out by Ridge Creek, free and clear, inherited from my late father, Thomas Whitmore. I'd like to see the recorded deed for my own property, which I believe is my legal right. And while you're at it, I'd like to see the records for the Callaway Ranch with Mr. Callaway here standing beside me, giving his leave, and any recent filings made by a Mr. Silas Mercer." She smiled. "Or I can ride back to Ridge Creek and fetch a lawyer to ask you the same thing in uglier language. Your choice, Mr. Pettigrew." Pettigrew looked at her and looked at Ethan, who was a very large man, taking up a very large amount of the doorway, and decided he did not want the trouble. "Wait here," he muttered. He came back with a stack of heavy-bound books and dropped them on the table with a thump that raised dust, and Clara sat down and opened the first one and began to read. Ethan paced. He wasn't a man built for sitting still in a quiet room, and after the third time he came to lean over her shoulder, she said without looking up, "Mr. Callaway, you are blocking my light and breathing on my neck, and I cannot read deeds with a man breathing on my neck." "Sorry." He straightened up. "What are we looking for?" "I don't know yet. That's why it's called looking." She turned a page. "When you find a lie, you'll know it. It'll be the thing that don't fit. A date out of order. A signature that's wrong. A piece of land that two different papers both say belongs to two different men. My father used to say a liar can write anything he wants on a single piece of paper, but he can't keep all his lies straight across a whole stack of them. Somewhere in here, Mercer's lies are going to bump into each other. I just have to read until they do." So she read. For an hour, for 2, for 3. The morning burned away, and the sour clerk brought no water, and the dust got in her throat, and Ethan paced and sat and paced again, and Clara turned page after page after page, her finger moving down the columns, her lips moving silent around the legal words, and Ethan watched her, and marveled quietly at the patience of her at the iron in this small, dusty woman who would sit and read 1,000 boring pages to find one true thing. And then at noon, Clara Whitmore went very still. "Mr. Callaway," she said softly. He was beside her in an instant. "What? What is it?" She didn't answer right away. She was reading a single page very slowly, reading it again. Her finger pressed hard against one line, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone strange and flat. "There's a deed of sale," she said. "Recorded in the county book. Transferring the Whitmore Ranch, my home, the place I was born, from my father, Thomas Whitmore, to the Cascade Land and Improvement Company of Chicago." Her finger trembled against the page. "Sold, free and clear, for $200. "That's a lie," Ethan said. "Your father never sold. He told Mercer to go to the devil. You said so yourself." "He did. He never sold. He'd never have sold for $200. The place is worth 20 times that, even as grass." Clara's voice was rising now, thin and shaking. "But it's recorded, Ethan. It's right here, signed and witnessed and filed with the county. There's his signature. There's my father's signature on a deed selling away everything he had. Then it's forged. We'll prove it's... Look at the date." Clara's finger moved up the page to the top, and she turned the book toward him so he could see it too, and she watched his face as he read it. Watched the moment it hit him, the way it had just hit her. The deed transferring Thomas Whitmore's ranch to Silas Mercer's Chicago company was dated the 14th of March. Thomas Whitmore had died on the 2nd of March. "He signed it 12 days after he was buried," Clara whispered. "My father sold his ranch 12 days after they put him in the ground." There it is, Ethan. There it is in the county's own book, written down for anybody with eyes to read it. He didn't just steal my land. He was so sure of himself, so certain nobody would ever look, that he didn't even bother to get the date right on the forgery. Her hand was shaking so hard the page rattled. "This is it. This is the paper. A dead man can't sign a deed. This is the thing that hangs him." For one long suspended moment, the two of them sat frozen over that book, and Clara Whitmore felt something she had not felt in 3 months. Not hope exactly, but its hard cousin. The certainty that justice was a real thing, and that it was finally within her reach. And then, through the dusty courthouse window, faint and far away across the long flat miles toward Ridge Creek, Ethan Callaway saw it first. He went to the window, slow like a man who didn't want to believe his own eyes, and he stood there looking south, and the color drained out of his sun-dark face. "Clara?" he said. He had never once called her Clara. "Clara, come here." She came. She looked where he was looking. Far off on the southern horizon, in the direction of home, in the direction of her father's house, and her father's barn, and the 5 empty graves, and everything she had left in the whole world, a thick black column of smoke was climbing into the clean blue summer sky. And it was rising from exactly where her farm should be. They did not speak on the ride home. There was nothing to say that would have been worth the breath. Ethan put his big bay to a gallop, and Clara's gray mare ran flat out beside him, and the two of them tore down the long road from Bozeman, with that black column of smoke growing taller and uglier in front of them, with every mile, and the only sounds were hooves and wind and the hammer of Clara's own heart. She knew before they crested the last rise. A body always knows. But knowing it didn't soften it any, and when her father's house came into view, Clara made a sound she had never made before in her life, a low, broken animal sound torn straight up out of her chest. The barn was already gone, just a black skeleton of beams with the fire still chewing through it. And the house she'd been born in, the house where her mother had died, and her father had taught her her letters, and where 2 tin cups still sat drying on the plank table, the house was burning from the inside out, flames pouring up through the roof, and there was not one single thing on God's earth that 2 people on tired horses could do to stop it. "The animals?" Clara gasped, already off her mare before it had fully stopped. "Ethan, the animals, I have to—" He caught her by the arm, hard. "Let me go." She fought him. "There's stock in that paddock, The paddock's open, Clara." His voice was steady and terrible. "Look, the gate's been thrown wide. Whoever did this drove your stock out first. They wanted them to live. They didn't want to be hanged for killing animals." His grip didn't loosen. "They wanted the house. They wanted the books. They wanted to burn every paper your father ever wrote down, so there'd be nothing left to prove a thing." Clara stopped fighting. She stood there shaking in his grip, watching the only home she'd ever known come apart in fire, and the truth of his words sank into her slow and cold. "The ledgers," she whispered. "Gone. They'll be ash by now." And then Clara Whitmore did the last thing Ethan expected. She laughed. It came out of her cracked and wild, half a sob and half something else, and she pressed her hand to her mouth and laughed into it, and Ethan looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Clara, he doesn't know." She turned to him with the firelight on her wet face and a terrible, fierce light in her eyes. "Don't you see it, Ethan? He burned the house to destroy the proof. He thinks the proof was in the books, but the proof ain't in the books." She gripped the front of his shirt with both filthy hands. "The proof is in the county courthouse at Bozeman, in the public record, in Mercer's own forged deed with my dead father's signature dated 12 days after his funeral. He burned my house down to destroy a thing that's sitting safe in a stone building 40 miles away, under the county's own lock and key." The laugh broke into something raw. "He killed my father, and he burned my home, and he was too clever by half, Ethan, because he just destroyed the one piece of evidence that didn't matter and left standing the one that does." Ethan Callaway stared at her. And then a grim hard light came up in his own face to match hers. "He showed his hand," Ethan said. "He showed his whole hand. A man doesn't burn down a dead girl's house unless he's scared of what's in it. And a man who's scared is a man who's about to make a mistake." They were still standing there, gripping each other in the heat of the burning house, when the first wagons came. It was the Pruitts first, from downstream, and then old Mrs. Avery, and then a half-dozen more, the whole nearer end of the valley, coming at the sight of smoke, the way valley folk always come with buckets and shovels, and no real hope of doing anything but watch. They formed a ragged line, and threw water that hissed into nothing, and within the hour, a fair piece of Ridge Creek had gathered on the scorched ground where Clara Whitmore's home used to be. And that was when Silas Mercer arrived. He came in a fine buggy, dressed in his good dark coat, despite the heat, and he climbed down slow and surveyed the ruin with an expression of such perfect, practiced sorrow that Clara wanted to claw it off his face with her bare hands. Beside him rode Sheriff Doyle, a heavy, tired man who'd held his office 12 years and never once gone looking for trouble. He didn't have to. Miss Whitmore. Mercer removed his hat and held it to his chest. I came the moment I heard. I am so deeply sorry. To lose your father and now your home in a single season. He shook his head. This valley has not been kind to you. Get off my land, Clara said. A ripple went through the gathered crowd. Mercer only looked sorrowful. Of course you're distraught, anyone would be. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice just slightly, just enough. Sheriff, I think we owe it to this poor girl to find out how this fire started. A house doesn't burn down on a calm, dry afternoon by accident. It surely doesn't, Clara said loud and clear. Somebody said it. Somebody drove out my stock so they wouldn't be charged with killing animals, and then they soaked my house in coal oil and lit it. You can smell the oil from here if your nose still works. Coal oil. Mercer nodded gravely. Yes, I noticed it myself. A terrible thing. He let a beat pass. Then gently, like a man who hated to say it. Sheriff Doyle doesn't Miss Whitmore keep coal oil for her lamps, living alone as she does. The crowd went quiet. Clara felt the trap close before she fully understood it. What are you saying? I'm not saying anything, Mercer said, all wounded innocence. I'm only sheriff. It's a difficult thing to speak of, but it must be spoken. There has been a great deal of misfortune around this young woman. Her father's accident, her dying cattle, the poisoned creek that's cost half this valley its stock and frightened every family with children near the water. He turned slowly, taking in the whole crowd, and Clara watched in horror as faces she'd known her whole life turned away from her, uncertain. And now, her own house burned to the ground, with her conveniently 40 miles away in Bozeman when it happened. A girl alone with no money, no family, and a ranch she can no longer work. He let the silence stretch. Folks, I take no joy in this. But I have to ask what we're all surely thinking. Who profits from a burned house but the one who collects the insurance? Who poisons a creek but the one who wants the blame to fall elsewhere? You filthy... Ethan started forward, but Clara's hand on his arm stopped him. Let him talk, she said quietly. Let him keep talking. He's not as clever as he thinks. But the crowd was murmuring now, and the murmur was turning against her, and Clara could feel it. The old, terrible loneliness she'd carried for 3 months, the certainty that when you stood up against a powerful man, you stood up alone. She poisoned the creek herself, someone muttered. Stands to reason. My children swam in that water, a woman said, and her voice was full of fear and the meanness that fear breeds. If she'd poison a creek with babies in it, I lost 2 milk cows to that water. There's a child sick at the Hollis place, fever won't break. The voices were rising, ugly, turning, and Silas Mercer stood in the middle of them, with his hat against his chest, and his sorrowful face, letting them do his work for him, and Clara understood with sick clarity that this was how he'd always done it. Not with a gun, with a whisper, with a crowd's own fear turned into a weapon and handed back to them. There ought to be a hearing, Mercer said, soft and reasonable into the rising noise. A proper hearing, for everyone's protection and for Miss Whitmore's own, so she can clear her name if she's able. Tonight, at the meeting hall, Sheriff. And Sheriff Doyle, who wanted nothing in this world but to not have to make a hard choice, looked at the angry crowd, and looked at the rich man, and looked at the poor orphaned girl, and he chose the easy road the way he always had. Reckon that's fair, Doyle said. Tonight, the hall. We'll hear it out. The meeting hall of Ridge Creek had never been so full. Word had run through the whole valley by supper time, and they came from every farm and every ranch. The curious, the frightened, the cruel, and the few who still cared. And they packed the rough plank benches and lined the walls, and at the front of the room, Silas Mercer sat in a good chair like a judge, and Clara Whitmore stood alone before all of them. She had not changed her dress. She had nothing to change into. She stood there in the same gray cotton she'd worn for 2 days, smelling of smoke. Her face streaked her hands black with the ash of her own home, and she did not bow her head. She kept her chin level and her back straight and her eyes steady, and she looked out at the faces of the people she'd grown up among, and she let them see her. "Miss Whitmore," Mercer began in a voice pitched for the whole room, "grave accusations have been raised that you may have poisoned Ridge Creek, endangering this valley's children and livestock. That you may have set fire to your own home for the insurance money. These are not my accusations. They are the questions of frightened neighbors, but they must be answered. So, what have you to say?" Clara was silent for a long moment, and then she spoke, and her voice did not shake. "I'll answer your questions, Mr. Mercer, but first I've got one of my own." She turned from him to face the crowd. "How many of you," she said, "have had Silas Mercer come to your door in the last 2 years and offer to buy your land?" The room went still. "Don't be shy. I'm not asking for confession. Just raise a hand. How many of you had a visit from this man with his good coat and his calm voice offering cash for your ranch?" A pause. Then slowly one hand went up at the back. Then another. Then 4 more. Then a dozen. Across the hall, hands rose uncertain, and the people holding them looked around and saw their neighbors' hands up too, and something shifted in the room, a recognition. "Now," Clara said, "keep your hands up. And here's my second question. How many of you, after you told him no, how many of you had a run of bad luck right after A, well gone bad? A barn fire. A note called in early. A horse that came up lame or worse." Her voice cut clean across the room. "How many of you said no to this man, and then watched your luck turn sour all at once?" The hands didn't go down. And now there were murmurs, but different murmurs than before, frightened but pointed in a new direction. Clara watched a man named Tully look at his own raised hand like he'd never seen it before. Watched Mrs. Avery, whose well had gone foul the spring before, go pale. "This is wild talk," Mercer said, and for the first time there was an edge under the smooth voice. "Misfortune is the lot of every rancher. You can't tie every dry well in the valley to one man." "No," Clara agreed. "I can't. Misfortune's real, and a dry well's a dry well." She turned back to him slowly. "But a forged deed. Mr. Mercer, a forged deed isn't misfortune. A forged deed is a crime, and a forged deed with a dead man's signature on it, a signature dated 12 days after the man was already in his grave. That's not just a crime." Her voice dropped, and somehow the drop made it carry farther than a shout. "That's proof of murder." The hall went utterly silent. "What did you say?" Mercer said. "You heard me." Clara reached into her apron, the same apron she'd worn for 2 days, the apron that had survived the fire, because it had survived on her own body, and she drew out a folded paper, and she held it up so the whole room could see it. "Before I rode home to find my house burning, Mr. Mercer, I spent the morning in the county courthouse at Bozeman, in the public land records, the ones any citizen has the right to read." She unfolded the paper with shaking but deliberate hands. "And I made a true copy witnessed and stamped by the county clerk himself of a deed of sale filed in that record. A deed transferring the Whitmore Ranch, my home, the home you burned down this afternoon to destroy what you thought was the only proof, to the Cascade Land and Improvement Company of Chicago, sold by my father, for $200. She looked up. "Would you like to know the date my father sold his life's work for $200, Mr. Mercer?" Mercer's face had gone the color of old paper. "The deed is dated the 14th of March, 1883, Clara said, and her voice rang out now, clear as a bell, filling every corner of that packed and silent hall. "My father, Thomas Whitmore, was thrown from his horse and killed on the 2nd of March. He was buried on the 5th. There are 40 people in this valley who stood at his graveside. Some of you are in this room." She turned in a slow circle, holding the paper high. "So I'd like one of you, anyone, to explain to me how a man who'd been dead and buried for 9 days rode into Bozeman on the 14th of March and signed away his ranch. Because either my father rose up out of his grave to rob his own daughter, or that signature is a forgery written by a man who was so arrogant, so certain, no woman would ever think to read the county record that he didn't even trouble himself to get the date right. She let the paper fall to her side. A dead man can't sign a deed, Clara said quietly. That's not my opinion. That's not wild talk. That's a date in the county's own book written down by the county's own clerk, and it cannot be argued with and it cannot be burned because it's sitting 40 miles from here in a stone building and there are 100 more copies the clerk can make of it. You burned my house for nothing, Mr. Mercer. Her voice cracked just slightly. You killed my father for grass. And you left the proof of it sitting in plain sight because you never once believed a girl in a dusty dress could read. For 3 full heartbeats, no one in the meeting hall moved. And then the room exploded. People were on their feet, shouting, turning to one another, and through the noise, Silas Mercer rose slowly from his good chair, and the sorrowful mask was gone, now peeled clean away, and underneath it was something cold and reptilian, and utterly without remorse. A clever forgery, Mercer said, raising his voice over the din, and the crowd quieted to hear him, because that was the kind of man he was. A very clever forgery made by a clever, desperate girl. Sheriff, look at what she's done. She's manufactured a document. Anyone can write a false date on a copy to frame an honest man for the crimes she herself committed. She poisoned the creek. She burned her house. And now she stands here waving a forged paper accusing me of the very crime she's guilty of with no proof but her own bitter word. He turned to the crowd, and the smoothness flowed back into him like water. Ask yourselves, who is more likely to forge a document, a respected man of business or a penniless girl with everything to gain and nothing left to lose? And to Clara's horror, she felt the room begin to turn again. Mercer was good. He was so good. He could take the truth and pour just enough doubt into it to make it murky, and a frightened crowd will always reach for the answer that lets them stop being afraid. That copy's stamped by the clerk, someone called out. She said, Clerks can be paid, Mercer said smoothly, or fooled. Sheriff Doyle, I think the only honest thing to do is take this girl into custody until we can sort fact from fancy for the protection of... That's enough. The voice came from the back of the hall, and it was Ethan Callaway's, and it cut through the noise like an axe through green wood. He came up the center aisle, slow, big and dust-caked and grim, and the crowd parted in front of him, and he didn't stop until he stood beside Clara Whitmore at the front of the room. And then he turned and faced the whole valley. Most of you have known me 20 years, Ethan said. Some of you longer. You know I'm not a man given to speeches. You know I keep to myself and keep my fences mended and don't go borrowing trouble. So when I tell you what I'm about to tell you, I'd ask you to weigh it against the man you've always known me to be. He set his jaw. I lost 6 head of cattle to that poisoned creek. My creek. The one that runs through my land before it ever reaches hers. Now you tell me why in God's name would Clara Whitmore poison the water upstream on my property, where her cattle barely drink to harm a herd that's mostly mine? It makes no sense, and you all know it makes no sense, and the only reason you're entertaining it is because Silas Mercer's got half of you owing him money and the other half scared of him. A low murmur. Ethan rolled on. I rode that creek with her. I saw the marks where barrels were set down to pour poison in up high on the ridge where pack mules came over from the far valley. Not from her land, from his side. He pointed straight at Mercer. And I'll tell you something else I know because I'm done being a coward about it. 2 days ago I rode up on this woman fighting to save a dying calf, and instead of helping her I laughed at her. I told her no man would ever marry her. His voice roughened. I've been ashamed of those words every hour since, because in 2 days I've watched Clara Whitmore bury her grief, read a stack of dead men's books by lamplight, to find her father's killer ride 40 miles to a courthouse and stand alone in front of a room full of people calling her a witch and a liar and never once bow her head. He turned and looked at her, and the whole hall saw it. Mercer says she poisoned that creek to trap me into marriage. I'm here to tell every soul in this room that she didn't need to trap me. She had me the moment she looked me in the eye in the dirt and refused to break. I was already hers before I had the sand to admit it. So you can call her a liar if you want. But you'll be calling me one too, and you'll have to do it to my face. But the silence afterward was a different kind of silence. And Mercer, seeing the room slipping, played his last card. "You see how it is," he said softly, sorrowfully to the crowd. "She's bewitched him. A good man, an honest man, reduced to making a public fool of himself for a scheming girl. It's the saddest part of all of this. Sheriff, he didn't cut the cinch." The voice was small and shaking, and came from the side of the hall, and the whole room turned toward it, and there, white-faced and trembling, and standing up on legs that barely held him, was Abel Henderson. "Abel," Mercer said very quietly, "sit down." But Abel Henderson did not sit down. "He didn't cut the cinch," Henderson said again louder, his voice breaking. "Tom Whitmore's saddle cinch. It was cut 3/4 through with a knife, so it'd hold on level ground and let go on a steep grade. A man named Roy Patch done it on Mercer's orders, and then bragged on it drunk in the saloon before Mercer sent him out of the territory." Tears were running down Henderson's face now, but his voice grew steadier with every word, the way a man's voice steadies when he's finally set down a stone he's carried too long. "And the poison in that creek, I carried it. God forgive me, I carried it up that ridge on my own mules, because Mercer threatened to put my sick wife out on the road if I didn't. He owns my note. He owns half this valley's notes. That's how he does it. He gets his hooks in a man, and then he makes that man do his dirt for him, and the man's too scared to talk, because talking means losing everything." Henderson turned to face the room, and his ruined face was almost peaceful now. "Well, I'm done being scared. I'd rather lose my land than carry one more day knowing I helped that man poison a creek where children swim and frame an innocent girl for it. He killed Tom Whitmore. I'll swear it on any Bible you put in front of me. He killed Tom Whitmore for the railroad that's coming, the one Tom found out about, the one Mercer's been buying up the whole valley for one threatened family at a time." The meeting hall erupted. This time, it did not turn back. This time, the noise had a direction, and the direction was Silas Mercer. And faces that had been afraid an hour before were on their feet now, and furious, and the names were coming out: my well, my barn, my note, my cattle, a whole valley's worth of misfortune suddenly knitting together into a single black design. And at the center of it, the man in the good coat, exposed at last, with the whole truth of him, laid bare in the lamplight. "Sheriff Doyle," Clara's voice somehow carried over all of it. She held up the stamped copy of the deed once more. "There's your proof a crime was committed. There's a living witness to murder and arson both. You've ducked the hard road your whole life. I'm watching you choose it right now in front of every soul in this valley. So choose." And Sheriff Doyle, heavy and tired and cornered at last into the thing he should have done 3 months before, put his hand on his pistol and turned toward Silas Mercer. "Silas Mercer," Doyle said heavily, "I'm placing you under arrest for—" He never finished the sentence, because Silas Mercer had not lived the life he'd lived by being a man who waited. In one smooth, practiced motion, the motion of a man who'd always known this moment might come and had prepared for it, he reached inside that fine dark coat and drew a small silver pistol. And before Doyle could clear leather, before Ethan could lunge, before anyone in that packed and shouting hall could so much as cry out, Silas Mercer leveled the gun. Not at the sheriff. At Clara Whitmore. "You should have learned to read less," he said. And he pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the closed hall, and for one frozen instant, Clara Whitmore did not understand what had happened, because she felt no pain. Then she felt the weight of him. Ethan Callaway had moved faster than a man his size had any right to move. He had thrown himself across the space between them in the breath before Mercer's finger closed, and the bullet that had been meant for Clara's heart had buried itself instead in the meat of Ethan's left shoulder. And now he was sagging against her, his weight bearing them both down, and his blood was hot and sudden against her hands. "Ethan!" Her voice came out a scream she didn't recognize. "Ethan! No! No!" "I'm all right," he gritted, though he plainly wasn't. Shoulder, just the shoulder. Clara. The hall had become bedlam. Silas Mercer, his shot spent, and the room turned to chaos, did the only thing left to a cornered animal. He bolted, shoving through the screaming crowd toward the side door, the silver pistol still smoking in his hand. And for one terrible moment, It looked as though he might make it, as though the man who had murdered Thomas Whitmore and poisoned a valley and burned a girl's home might simply walk out into the dark and vanish the way his hired killer Roy Patch had vanished. "Stop him!" Sheriff Doyle bellowed, finally clearing his pistol, but the crowd was in his line, and he could not shoot. And it was Abel Henderson, weak, scared, guilt-ridden Abel Henderson, who had carried poison up a ridge because he was too frightened to refuse, who stepped into the doorway and blocked it with his own body. "You ain't going nowhere, Silas," Henderson said. Mercer raised the pistol. "Get out of my way, Abel." "No." Henderson's voice shook, but his feet didn't move. "I done enough things you told me to do. I ain't doing this one. You want out that door, you'll have to shoot me too, in front of 40 witnesses, and then you'll hang twice over." For one heartbeat, Mercer's finger tightened on the trigger, and then 3 ranchers hit him at once. Tully had him by the gun arm, and old Avery's son by the collar, and a 4th man Clara couldn't see drove him down against the doorframe, and the silver pistol clattered to the floorboards and was kicked away. And Silas Mercer, who had ruled the whole valley with a calm voice and a good coat and a quiet patience, went down under the weight of the men he had spent 2 years grinding into the dirt, screaming threats that no one was listening to anymore. "Get him cuffed," Doyle was shouting. "Get him cuffed and get him in irons, by God." But Clara had stopped watching Mercer. She was on her knees on the meeting hall floor with Ethan Callaway's head in her lap, and her hands pressed hard against the wound in his shoulder, and the blood was coming through her fingers faster than she liked. Far faster, and the old cold fear was rising in her again, the fear she knew too well. The fear of losing the one thing left in the world. "Don't you dare," she said to him, fierce and low. "Don't you dare, Ethan Callaway. I just got you. You hear me? I am not digging another grave. I have dug 6 this summer, and I will not dig a 7th, not for you. So you keep your eyes open, and you keep breathing." "Bossy," he managed with a ghost of that crooked half-smile. "You're awful bossy for a woman holding my whole life in her 2 hands. "Somebody get me clean cloth," Clara called over her shoulder, all business. Now the fear pressed down hard beneath the work the way it always was with her. "And whiskey and a needle and thread, the strongest thread you've got. Mrs. Avery, your sewing kit. I know you've got one in that bag. You've never gone anywhere without it in your life." She pressed harder on the wound, and Ethan hissed. "The ball went clean through. I can feel the exit. That's good. That's good, Ethan. You hear me? Clean through is the kind a man lives from. I read it in my father's book 100 times. Clean through and kept clean, and a man lives." "You read it in a book," he said faintly. "I read everything in a book." Her voice cracked just slightly. "It's the only thing I've ever been good for, and tonight it's going to keep you alive, so hush." They carried him to the doctor's house 2 streets over, and Clara would not leave his side. And when old Doc Pruitt, a tired man roused from his bed, moved too slow and too uncertain for her liking, Clara took the needle from his hand herself. "I've stitched 100 animals," she told him. "Hide's hide. Step aside or work beside me, but I'm not standing here wringing my hands while he bleeds." And Doc Pruitt, who had delivered half the valley and buried the other half, looked at this dust and ash-covered young woman with her father's grief in her eyes and her father's books in her head, and he did something he'd never done in 40 years of practice. He stepped aside. She cleaned the wound and she packed it, and she stitched it closed front and back with stitches as small and even as any the doctor could have laid. And the whole time she talked to Ethan low and steady, not because he needed the talking, but because she did. "You're a fool," she told him, threading the needle through. "Throwing yourself in front of a bullet. What kind of fool does that?" "The kind that meant what he said in that hall," Ethan murmured, sweat standing out on his brow. "Every word." Clara's hands went still for just a moment. "You shouldn't have said it," she said quietly. "In front of everyone. You shouldn't have—" "I should have said it sooner." He caught her wrist with his good hand. "I've spent 5 years telling myself I didn't need a single soul on this earth, calling it strength. It wasn't strength, Clara. It was hiding. A man can hide his whole life behind the word independent and call himself brave for it." His grip tightened. "You're the bravest person I ever met, And you never once hid from a thing. Not your grief. Not Mercer. Not a room full of people calling you a witch. You just stood there and let them see you, and refused to break. His eyes found hers. I want to learn how to be that. I think the only way I learn it is next to you. Clara looked down at him. This big, stubborn, proud man laid low with her stitches in his shoulder, and she felt the last hard wall inside her. The one she'd built brick by brick over 3 months of digging graves alone begin finally to come down. Finish bleeding on the doctor's table first, she said, but her voice had gone soft. Then we'll talk about the rest. It was near dawn before the worst of it was over. The valley did not sleep that night. Word ran from farm to farm faster than any rider could have carried it that the Whitmore girl had been right all along, that Mercer was a murderer, that the calm man in the good coat who'd held half their notes had been bleeding them dry for 2 years while smiling in their faces. And one by one, all through that long night and into the gray morning, they came to Sheriff Doyle's office, where Mercer sat in irons, and they told their stories. Tully came first. Said Mercer had offered to buy his place, and when he'd refused his prize, Bull had been found dead in the pasture with no mark on it, and a month later, Mercer had offered again lower, and Tully had nearly sold out of pure fear before his wife talked him out of it. Then the widow Carson, whose well had gone bad the same week she turned Mercer down. Then a man named Briggs who'd had a barn fire he'd always blamed on lightning on a night with no storm. Then old Avery, whose note Mercer had called early, forcing him to sell off half his herd at a loss, and who'd later learned Mercer had bought that very herd back through a third party for a fraction of its worth. Story after story after story, all of them small, all of them dismissed at the time as bad luck, as misfortune, as the hard lot of ranching, and all of them laid side by side in the lamplight of the sheriff's office, forming the unmistakable shape of one man's patient, ruthless design. Clara sat in the corner of that office, through all of it, having finally been persuaded to leave Ethan sleeping under the doctor's care. And she wrote it all down. Every name, every date, every well and barn and bull and note. She filled page after page in a fresh ledger that Mrs. Avery had pressed into her hands, and she organized it the way her father had taught her in columns in order cross-referenced until the whole crime lay before her in plain, honest figures that no lawyer in any court could argue with. You ought to rest, child, Mrs. Avery said gently somewhere near sunrise. You've been through more in 3 days than most folks see in a lifetime. I'll rest when it's done, Clara said, not looking up. My father used to say the figures don't lie. People lie, but figures don't. Mercer lied to this whole valley for 2 years and got away with it because nobody wrote the lies down where they bumped into each other. Her pen scratched on. I'm writing them down now, and when I'm finished, there won't be a hole in it big enough for that man to crawl through. She was nearly finished when the door opened, and the man who walked in was a stranger. He was dusty from hard travel, lean and watchful, with a badge on his coat that Clara didn't recognize at first, and then she did, and her breath caught. Name's Hollister, the man said to the room. Deputy United States Marshal out of the Territorial Office. He took off his hat. I've ridden 2 days on word that came up from a clerk in Bozeman fellow named Pettigrew. Of all people got a conscience all of a sudden when a young lady came in asking about a deed, and he started looking close at the filings she was asking after. He looked around the office. Which one of you is the Whitmore girl? Clara rose slowly. I'm Clara Whitmore. The marshal looked at her a long moment. You the one figured out the dead man's deed? I am. Then I expect you'll want to hear this. Hollister pulled a folded paper from his coat. The Cascade Land and Improvement Company of Chicago has been under federal eye for the better part of a year. Land fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy across 3 territories, buying up land along proposed rail routes through forged deeds and forced sales using local agents to do the dirty work so the company's own hands stayed clean. He tapped the paper. Your Silas Mercer was their agent for this whole stretch of Montana. We knew the company was crooked. What we never had was proof tying a specific agent to a specific killing. And then a deed turns up with a dead man's signature dated 9 days after his funeral. He looked at Clara with something close to wonder. Miss, federal investigators have been trying to break this ring for a year. You broke it in one morning with a courthouse ledger and a calendar. The room was very quiet. There's a railroad coming then, Clara said slowly. It was real. The survey my father found. It's real, Hollister confirmed. Spurline approved this spring, which is exactly why the Cascade Company was so hot to own every acre along it before any of you poor ranchers found out what your dirt was worth. His jaw hardened. They figured you for ignorant. They figured you'd sell your great-grandchildren's fortune for grass money and never know the difference. They were wrong about most of you. They were dead wrong about you, miss. But Clara had gone still, and the others in the room could see her mind working, turning something over, and after a moment she said quietly, Marshall, if the deeds are forged, if Mercer forged my father's name and others, then on paper the Cascade Company still owns this land, doesn't it, in the county's own book. The same book that's going to hang Mercer is the book that says a Chicago company owns half this valley. Marshall Hollister's face turned grim because she had put her finger square on the cruelest part of it. That's so, he admitted. A forged deed's a crime, but until a court strikes it down, it stands in the record. The company'll fight. They've got lawyers in Chicago thicker than fleas on a hound, and they'll argue they were innocent purchasers who didn't know their agent forged anything, and they'll try to hold the land while the courts chew on it for years. Folks could be put off their places long before any judge sorts it out. He shook his head. I won't lie to you. You've won the criminal case. The land case is another fight, and it's a longer, dirtier one. And there it was, the thing Clara had feared, the thing that turned even victory bitter. Mercer in irons. The truth told the valley awake at last, and still on paper in the cold machinery of the law. The railroads company could yet take everything. Clara was silent for a long moment. Then she set down her pen, and she looked up at the marshal, and there was a light in her eyes that made even that hard-bitten federal man lean back a little. Marshal Hollister, she said, how does a company prove it's an innocent purchaser? It shows it paid fair value and had no knowledge of the fraud. Bought in good faith, dealt at arm's length from the agent. It shows it dealt at arm's length from Mercer. Clara stood up. But it didn't deal at arm's length from Mercer, did it? Because no Chicago company sends $200 across the country on the word of one agent without a single letter, a single instruction, a single account written down somewhere. She was moving now, pacing her mind, racing ahead of her words. There's correspondence. There has to be. Mercer kept books. A man like that always keeps books careful, exact, because he didn't trust the company any more than they trusted him. He'd have kept every letter they sent him telling him which lands to take and how much to spend and what to do with the men who said no. He'd have kept it as insurance so that if it ever came down to a rope, it wouldn't be his neck alone in the noose. She turned to Hollister. Where does Silas Mercer live, Marshal? A slow, dangerous smile spread across the federal man's face. He's got a house at the south end of the valley, he said. And as it happens, I've got a federal warrant in my saddlebag that lets me search every inch of it. They found the letters in a strongbox under the floor of Mercer's study, just as Clara had said they would, 2 years of correspondence with the Cascade Land and Improvement Company in the company's own hand, on the company's own letterhead, instructing their agent which ranches to acquire, authorizing payments, and in 2 damning letters responding with cold approval to Mercer's reports that the Whitmore matter has been permanently resolved, and the Callaway problem will require firmer methods. Clara read them sitting on the floor of the dead man's study, and when she came to the line about her father permanently resolved, she had to stop and press the back of her hand to her mouth, and Marshal Hollister, watching, took off his hat and did not say a word until she was ready to go on. They knew, she said finally, her voice hollow. Chicago knew. They didn't just turn a blind eye. They ordered it. They sat in their fine offices 1,000 miles away and read a letter that said my father was permanently resolved, and they wrote back, well done. She looked up. These letters mean the company can't claim it was innocent. These letters, said Hollister quietly, mean the company is going to spend the next 10 years in federal court, and every forged deed it holds in this valley is going to be struck down as the fruit of a conspiracy it directed. You haven't just saved your own land, Miss Whitmore. He helped her to her feet. You've saved every family Mercer ever cheated. The Hendersons, the Averys, Tully, all of them. There won't be a Chicago lawyer alive who can hold land bought with these letters in the strongbox. Word of that spread through the valley too. And the second wave of folks who came to Clara Whitmore over the following days came not to tell their stories, but to say something harder, to say they were sorry. Mrs. Hollis came first, the woman whose sick child Clara had been blamed for, the woman who'd stood in the meeting hall and said if she'd poison a creek with babies in it. She came to the doctor's house where Clara was still tending Ethan, and she stood in the doorway twisting her bonnet in her hands, and she could barely get the words out. I said a terrible thing about you, Mrs. Hollis whispered. In the hall, in front of everyone. I was scared for my girl and I said a terrible thing and you'd just lost your house and... Her voice broke. I'm ashamed, Miss Whitmore. I'm so deeply ashamed. Clara looked at her for a long moment, and she did not rush to forgive because Clara Whitmore was not a woman who forgave easily, and the wound was still raw, and she'd be a liar to pretend it wasn't. Your girl, she said finally. Is her fever broke? Mrs. Hollis blinked. Yes, it broke 2 nights ago, thank the Lord. Then go home and hold her, Clara said. And the next time you're scared, Mrs. Hollis, the next time somebody hands you somebody else to blame, so you don't have to be afraid, you remember how this felt. You remember standing in my doorway, and you do better. She turned back to Ethan. That's all I've got to say about it. I'm not ready for more, and I won't pretend I am. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was honest, and Mrs. Hollis seemed to understand that honest was more than she'd earned, and she went home to hold her daughter. They came like that for a week. The apologizers and Clara took each one the same way, without cruelty, but without easy comfort either. She let them feel what they'd done. It wasn't in her to do otherwise. The realest healing, the kind that mattered, didn't happen in apologies. It happened out by the cottonwoods at the dry end of Ethan's land, where the old emergency well had caved in years before, and where now, with the creek poisoned, and the cattle on both ranches dying of thirst in the brutal heat, there was only one chance left to save the stock that remained. They had to dig. And Ethan Callaway, against every order Clara and the doctor gave him, came out to dig with one arm in a sling. You'll tear those stitches, Clara snapped at him, hauling a bucket of dirt up out of the deepening hole. Then you'll sew them again. You're good at it. He drove the shovel one-handed into the earth. I am not lying in a bed while my cattle die and you dig my well for me. It's not your well. It's our well now, you stubborn ox. Half my stock's drinking from it too. Our well then? He grinned through the sweat and the pain. First thing we've owned together. Romantic, ain't it? You're delirious, Clara said, but she was fighting a smile and losing. It took 6 days. 6 days under the worst of the summer sun, the two of them, and a rotating crew of the very neighbors who'd turned on Clara a week before, Tully and Avery's boy, and even Abel Henderson, who showed up the first morning without a word, and dug harder than any of them day after day, as if he could dig his way clean of what he'd done. Their hands blistered, and the blisters broke, and their tempers flared, and they argued about everything. How deep to dig, how to shore the walls, whether they'd struck damp or just hope. And through all of it, something settled between Clara and Ethan that no declaration in a meeting hall ever could have settled. Something built out of shared labor and dirt and exhaustion, and the steady proof hour after hour that this was a person who would not quit and would not leave. On the 6th day, just past noon, Abel Henderson's shovel came up wet. Water, he said, and then louder, his voice cracking. Water, by God, there's water. They dug another 2 feet, and it came welling up cold and clear and clean, and the whole crew of them stood around that hole, whooping and laughing and pounding each other on the backs, and Clara Whitmore sat down hard in the dirt at the edge of the well and put her face in her blistered hands and wept. Not from grief this time, but from the other thing, the thing she'd had so little of in 3 long months that she'd nearly forgotten its name. Relief. Ethan lowered himself down beside her in the dirt, careful of his shoulder, and for a while he didn't say anything. He just sat next to her while she cried the way he had on the ridge that first day, waiting it out like weather. "I had it wrong," he said, finally quiet when she'd gone still. "All those years. I thought needing somebody made you weak. I thought the strong thing was to stand alone and not let anybody close enough to be lost." He looked out at the cattle already crowding down toward the new water. "But I watched you these 3 weeks. You needed help, and you took it when it was offered, and you gave it when it was asked. And you never once stopped being the strongest person in any room you walked into. Needing folks didn't make you weak. It's the thing that beat Mercer. One girl alone never could have. It took the whole valley, and it took you having the sand to let them in." Clara wiped her face with the back of her wrist. "I had it wrong too," she admitted. "I thought surviving was the same as living. I thought if I just kept moving, kept working, kept digging graves and reading books by lamplight, I'd never have to feel how alone I was." Her voice dropped. "I called it being independent. It was just being scared. Scared to need anybody because everybody I ever needed got taken from me." She looked at him. "My mother, my father. I figured if I never needed anybody again, I could never lose anybody again. And now?" Clara was quiet a long moment, looking at this man covered in well dirt with his arm in a sling and her stitches in his shoulder. This man who had laughed at her in the dust 3 weeks ago and then stepped in front of a bullet for her. "Now I figure," she said slowly, "that a life spent never needing anybody, so you can never lose anybody, that's not living at all. That's just dying real slow and calling it being careful." She drew a breath. "I'm done being careful." Ethan Callaway turned to her, and for once the crooked half-smile was gone, and what was on his face instead was something open and unguarded and almost frightened. "Clara Whitmore," he said, "I've got no house to offer you that's any better than the burned one you came from. I've got a ranch in debt and an arm I can't lift and a reputation as the proudest fool in the valley. But I would like if you'll allow it to court you. Proper. The way your father would have wanted a man to. With my hat in my hand and my intentions honest in front of God and the whole valley that watched me act the fool." His voice roughened. "I'd like the chance to spend the rest of my days arguing with the strongest woman I ever met. If she'll have me." Clara looked at him for a long, long moment. And then a slow smile came over her dust-streaked face. The same fierce knowing smile she'd given him at her gate the morning after he'd laughed at her, the morning everything started to change. "Only," she said, "if you can survive arguing with me for the rest of your life. Because I warn you, Ethan Callaway, I am right considerably more often than you are, and I will never once let you forget it. And I will read every contract you ever sign, and correct every figure in every ledger you ever keep. And I do not forgive easy, and I do not bend. And any man fool enough to want me had best know all that going in." Ethan threw back his head and laughed, the first real laugh she'd heard from him. Big and helpless, and full of something that had been locked away in him for 5 long years. "Miss Whitmore," he said, reaching out with his good hand to take her blistered one. "I'm counting on it." And out past the cottonwoods, the cattle drank deep from the clean cold water of a well that 2 stubborn people had dug together with their own bleeding hands. And for the first time since her father died, Clara Whitmore let herself believe that the hardest part was finally behind her. The courting did not go smooth, because nothing between Clara Whitmore and Ethan Callaway ever went smooth, and neither one of them would have trusted it if it had. He came calling proper the very first Sunday after the well struck water, with his arm still in its sling, and a fistful of wild prairie roses he'd cut one-handed and half-crushed in the cutting. And he stood at the gate of the little cabin the Averys had loaned Clara until she could rebuild, and he took off his hat and held it against his chest, and he said, "Miss Whitmore, I've come to call if you'll have me." And Clara, drying her hands on her apron in the doorway, looked at the mangled roses and the sling and the sweat already standing on his brow from the ride over, and she said, "Those flowers are half dead. Ethan Callaway. I cut them one-handed. You could have waited till you had 2. I didn't want to wait." He held them out anyway. A man who spent 5 years waiting to feel something doesn't much care to wait once he finally does. Clara took the flowers. They were the first flowers any man had ever brought her in her life, and they were ruined, and she pressed them to her face anyway and breathed them in. And something in her chest came loose that had been clenched tight since she was a girl. "Coffee's on," she said. "2 cups. I've been setting out 2 cups every morning for 3 months out of habit, and every morning I pour the second one back because there was nobody to drink it." She stepped back from the door. "You might as well drink it, so it stops being a thing I grieve over and starts being a thing I expect." It was the most romantic thing she knew how to say, and Ethan understood it for exactly what it was, and he ducked his head to hide his face and stepped inside. They argued before the coffee was even poured. About the well, about whose cattle had drunk first, about whether he should be riding at all with that shoulder, about everything and nothing. And it was the easiest, warmest hour either of them had spent in years. But the valley was not done with its troubles yet. Word came in late August that Silas Mercer's trial had been set for the territorial court in Helena, and that the Cascade Land and Improvement Company of Chicago had hired the finest lawyer in the territory to defend, not Mercer. They'd cut Mercer loose, of course, a low agent who'd exceeded his instructions. Nothing to do with the fine gentleman in Chicago, but to defend the deeds, the land. Because the railroad spur had been confirmed, now surveyed and staked, and the valley that had been worth grass money in the spring was worth a fortune by autumn, and the company meant to hold every crooked acre of it that it could. The lawyer's name was Mr. Edgar Coyle, and he came out to Ridge Creek in a hired buggy with a leather case full of papers, and he did not go to the sheriff or the court. He came straight to Clara. "Miss Whitmore." He was a smooth man, smoother even than Mercer had been, with soft hands and a softer voice. "I represent the Cascade Land and Improvement Company. I've come to make peace." "Have you?" Clara said. She did not invite him to sit. "The company deeply regrets the actions of its former agent, Mr. Mercer. Deeply. A criminal, an embarrassment, a man who betrayed the trust placed in him." Coyle spread his soft hands. "But the company itself acted in good faith. It purchased land. It paid for that land. And while we understand there are irregularities in some of the deeds, surely it's in everyone's interest to settle this quietly, rather than dragging it through years of costly litigation that will benefit no one but the lawyers." He smiled. "The company is prepared to be generous. Very generous. We'll pay full railroad value for the Whitmore and Callaway tracks, a sum that would set you and Mr. Callaway up for life 10 times over. You'd never have to dig another well or mend another fence as long as you lived. All we ask in return is your cooperation, and of course, the smile thinned, the return of certain private company correspondence that came improperly into the hands of a federal marshal. Letters that frankly were stolen from Mr. Mercer's home and have no business in a courtroom." And there it was. The whole game laid plain. A fortune for the land, a fortune for silence, and the letters buried. The letters that said the Whitmore matter has been permanently resolved, the letters that proved a company in Chicago had ordered her father killed for grass. Clara was quiet for a long moment. "You want me to sell you my father's land," she said slowly. "The land you murdered him for. And you want me to do it for money. And you want me to hand over the letters that prove you murdered him, so that no one ever knows, so that you walk free and clean and rich, and Silas Mercer hangs alone for a thing the whole company ordered." She tilted her head. "Is that about the shape of it, Mr. Coyle?" "You make it sound so ugly," Coyle said gently. "I'd call it pragmatic. Your father is gone, Miss Whitmore. No amount of letters brings him back. The living have to think of the living. You're a young woman with no home and no money and a wounded suitor and a hard road ahead. I'm offering you an easy one. Most people in your position would be wise to take it." Clara looked at him, and then she did something that made Edgar Coyle, smooth as he was, take a half step back. She smiled. "My father," she said, "told me something once. He said a man who keeps his figures honest can't be cheated by a man who doesn't. He said the figures don't lie. People lie, but figures don't." She walked to the small table where her new ledger sat, and she laid her hand on it. "You came here thinking you were dealing with a poor orphaned girl who'd take money and be grateful. But I've spent the last month doing the same thing I did to Mercer Mr. Coyle. I've been reading. I've made true, certified copies of every one of those letters, 6 full copies witnessed and stamped, one of them already in the hands of the federal marshal, one with a lawyer in Helena, one with a newspaper man in Bozeman who's been hungry for a railroad fraud story for a year, and 3 more in places you will never find. She held his eyes. You can't buy back what's already scattered to the wind. And you can't bury me because I made sure that if anything happens to me, a fall from a horse, a fire, a sudden bad turn of luck, every one of those copies gets opened the same week, and the name of the Cascade Land and Improvement Company is in every newspaper from here to Chicago by month's end. She leaned in. I learned that trick from you, Mr. Coyle, from Mercer. He should have kept his lies from bumping into each other. He didn't. And neither did your company the day it wrote well done in answer to a letter about murdering my father. Usana ni paitie. Edgar Coyle's smooth face had gone gray. So, here's my counteroffer, Clara said quietly. You will not get my land, you will not get the letters, and you will not get Silas Mercer's neck alone, because those letters are going to put every man in your Chicago office in a federal courtroom beside him. The only thing I'll offer you, Mr. Coyle, is this. You can climb back in that buggy and tell the gentleman who sent you that the orphaned girl in the dusty dress read every word 3 times the way her father taught her, and that she is not for sale, and that neither is he. Coyle left without another word. He never came back. And when Clara told Ethan about it that evening, Ethan was quiet for a long while, and then he shook his head slow. I keep thinking I've taken your full measure, he said. And then you go and stare down a Chicago lawyer like he's a stray calf in the wrong field. He reached for her hand. Your father would be proud, Clara. So proud he couldn't hardly stand it. He'd tell me I should have gotten it in writing, Clara said, but her eyes were wet. The trial in Helena lasted 9 days, and Clara testified for 2 of them, and the territory had never seen anything like it. A young woman in a plain dress reading deeds and dates and letters into the record with a clarity that made the company's expensive lawyers look like fools. The dead man's deed alone might have hanged Mercer. The strongbox letters damned the company entire. Abel Henderson testified shaking but unbroken about the poison and the mules and the threats. And on the 7th day, the federal marshals brought in their final witness, a lean, hard-drinking man they'd run to ground in a mining camp 3 territories away, Roy Patch. He'd been caught trying to sell a story to a saloon keeper, the same story he'd told drunk in Ridge Creek a season before, and the marshals had been waiting. And on the stand with a deal for his own neck dangling in front of him, Roy Patch told the court in flat, ugly words exactly how he had cut Thomas Whitmore's saddle cinch 3/4 through with a knife on Silas Mercer's orders, so it would hold on level ground and fail on the steep grade down into Cutter's Ravine. Clara sat in the gallery and listened to the man describe her father's murder as casually as another man might describe shoeing a horse, and she did not look away. Not once. Not for a single word of it. She had waited 3 months to hear the truth said out loud, in a place where it would matter. She would not flinch from it now. When Patch finished, the courtroom was dead silent. And Silas Mercer, who had sat through 9 days with the calm reptilian patience that had fooled a whole valley for 2 years, finally turned in his chair and looked back at Clara Whitmore across the crowded room. You should have sold, he said quietly. It was the only thing he said to her in all 9 days. Your father should have sold. None of this had to happen. Clara held his gaze, and her voice when it came was steady as stone. My father didn't sell because the land was his, she said. And I didn't sell because he was mine. Some things aren't for trading, Mr. Mercer. You spent your whole life never understanding that. I expect you'll have a good while now to think it over. The jury was out for 2 hours. They convicted Silas Mercer of murder in the 1st degree. He was hanged in the spring. The deeds were struck down, every forged one of them, and the land, Clara's Ethan's, the Hendersons, the Averys, Tully's, all of it was restored to the families Mercer had stolen it from. And when the railroad came through that autumn, it came through a valley of free landholders who knew exactly what their ground was worth, and not one of them was fool enough to sell it cheap. Ridge Creek did not become a ghost town the way the company had planned. It became prosperous. It became a place where the cattle pens met the rail line, and the families who'd nearly lost everything passed something down to their children instead. Clara and Ethan married at the small Ridge Creek church in October, on a clear, cool morning, with the whole valley packed into the pews and standing in the yard outside, and there was not a soul among them who hadn't watched some piece of the story unfold. Abel Henderson stood up with Ethan. It was Ethan who'd asked him, "You blocked a door with your own body when a killer had a gun on you," Ethan had said when Henderson tried to refuse, ashamed. "You stood up in that hall and told the truth when telling it could have cost you everything. A man who'll do that is a man I want standing beside me, Abel. The rest is behind us." And Mrs. Hollis, who had called Clara a witch in the meeting hall, sewed Clara's wedding dress with her own hands, working 3 weeks on it, refusing any payment, and when she finished it, she brought it to Clara with her head bowed. "I know it doesn't undo what I said," Mrs. Hollis whispered. "I don't expect it to." And Clara, who did not forgive easy, looked at the dress, the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for her, and looked at the frightened, sorry woman holding it, and she found finally that the wound had healed enough. "It's not what you said that I'll remember," Clara told her. "It's that you spent 3 weeks trying to make it right. Folks make mistakes when they're scared, Mrs. Hollis. What counts is what they do after. You did better." She took the dress. "Thank you. It's beautiful. I'll wear it proud." Mrs. Hollis wept, and Clara let her, and it was at last forgiveness. The wedding itself was simple, the way both of them wanted it. No grand speeches. When the preacher asked Ethan Callaway whether he would have this woman, Ethan looked at Clara standing there in Mrs. Hollis's dress, with her chestnut hair braided low the way she'd always worn it, and he said, "I will. I've wanted to since the morning she stood up out of the dirt and told me she only needed one man brave enough." And when the preacher asked Clara whether she would have this man, Clara looked at the proud, stubborn, big-hearted fool who'd laughed at her once and then stepped in front of a bullet for her, and she said, "You laughed at me once, Ethan Callaway. You sat up on your horse and told me no man would ever marry me." A smile broke across her face, fierce and warm. "I told you, only if you ask me. Well, you asked me." Her voice steadied into something like a vow within a vow. "So yes, I will. For as long as we both stay stubborn enough to keep choosing it." The valley laughed and wept, and the bell rang out over Ridge Creek, and Clara Whitmore became Clara Callaway in front of every soul who'd watched her stand alone and refused to break. Their 2 properties became one working ranch, the largest in the valley, and it ran better than either had ever run alone. Clara kept the books, kept them the way her father had taught her, honest and exact, every figure where it belonged. And within a year, she'd built the Callaway Ranch into the most carefully run outfit in the territory. The kind of place other ranchers came to ask advice, of the kind that never once got cheated by a man with a smooth voice and a leather case, because the woman who kept its accounts could read a lie at 40 paces. Ethan repaired every weak fence post before she had to ask. It became a private joke between them. Clara would walk a fence line frowning at a leaning post and turn to mention it and find it already mended. "How do you always know?" she demanded once. "Because I learned the hard way," he said, "that the things you don't tend to are the things that come back to bite you. A loose fence post, a lonely woman in the dirt with a dying calf." He kissed her temple. "I tend to things now, before they're asked." They argued, of course. They argued about cattle and corn and water rights and whose turn it was to ride the South Line. And they argued about money and about the children when the children came. 2 of them, a girl named Tom for her grandfather and a boy who had Ethan's stubborn jaw. And they argued until the very end of their days about who had been right about the runaway calf that started it all. And the years went by the way years do, gentle and then sudden. The railroad made Ridge Creek a town and then a small city. The dusty fence line where a man had once laughed at a woman became a paved road. The little church where they married got a steeple. And the 2 stubborn people who dug a well together with their own bleeding hands grew old together on the porch of the house they'd built where her father's burned one had stood. It was on that porch on a summer evening more than 40 years after it all began that an old man and an old woman sat watching the sun go down, red over a valley full of cattle that were partly theirs, and grandchildren that were entirely theirs. You know, Ethan said, his voice gone thin and slow with age, but his eyes still sharp. I was thinking on that calf today, the one that broke through my fence and started this whole business. Ruined my peace, that calf did. I had a fine, quiet, bitter little life all planned out, and that fool animal wandered into my field and wrecked it. Clara, white-haired now, her hands gnarled from 60 years of honest work, reached over and took his. That calf, she said, didn't ruin your peace, Ethan Callaway. That calf saved your heart. You just didn't know the difference between the two yet. He laughed the same big, helpless laugh she'd first heard at the edge of a half-dug well, only worn soft now by all the years. I reckon you're right, he said. You always were. More often than me, just like you promised. I told you I'd never let you forget it. You never have. He squeezed her hand. 60 years, and you never have, and I thank God for every argument. They sat there a long while as the light went, two old people who had buried grief and outlasted villains and dug their love up out of hard, dry ground with their own hands, and who had never once in all the years between stopped choosing each other. And that is the whole truth of what Clara Whitmore learned in the blazing summer of 1883, on her knees in the dirt with a dying calf and a cruel man laughing down at her from his horse, and what she carried to the end of her long and stubborn life. True love is not the soft thing the storybooks promise. It is not found in a perfect man or a grand speech or a life without struggle. It is built by two flawed, stubborn, frightened people who decide again and again to stand together in public, to tell each other the truth in private, to mend what's broken before they're asked, and to keep choosing one another on the hard days as fiercely as on the easy ones. Clara was right about the calf, and right about the figures, and right about most everything. But she was never more right than this. The bravest thing a person can ever do is let someone in. And the strongest love in this world is not the love that was never tested. It is the love that was tested by fire and poison and grief and a cruel man's greed and refused every single time to break.